Welcome to the fourth Afronomicslaw.org Indaba. Indaba is a Zulu word that refers to a meeting to discuss a serious topic. It also refers to a discussion on a matter of concern or of discussion. This occasional series discusses issues about international economic law as they relate to Africa, the developing world, and the global south. The discussion introduces expert voices to our audience who work very hard on the issues we care most about here at Afronomicslaw.org. These individuals do so often behind the scenes, invisible to our audience, yet their insights are invaluable to the work that we do. Our guest for this Indaba is Professor Michael Fakhri. Professor Fakhri was appointed Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food by the United Nations Human Rights Council in March 2020, and he assumed his functions on the 1st of May 2020. He is a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, where he teaches courses on human rights, food law, development, and commercial law. He is also the director of the Food Resiliency Project in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center. He received his doctorate from the University of Toronto, master's from Harvard Law School, Bachelor of Laws from Queen's University, and the Bachelor of Science in Ecology from Western University. He has taught courses on the right to food at Harvard Law School, European University Institute, and the University of Arizona Indigenous Governance Program. He has delivered lectures on international human rights and development topics at universities in places such as South Africa, Egypt, Lebanon, Qatar, Singapore, Italy, Switzerland, Iceland, the United States, and the United Kingdom. He has also led public dialogues on human rights and development with peasant organizations, labor unions, and human rights activists in the Arab region and North America, and at international organizations such as the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference. During his practice as a lawyer, Professor Fakhri fought for the rights of people who were indigent and incarcerated in a psychiatric institution. His publications include A History of Food Security and Agriculture in International Trade, 1945 to 2017, published in the European Yearbook of International Law in 2020. Food as a Matter of Global Governance, published in the Journal of International Law and International Relations in 2015, and a very important monograph titled Sugar and the Making of International Law, published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. I will start with quotes from your paper, Introduction, Questioning Twill's Agenda, published in the Oregon Review of International Law in 2012. In explaining your journey to Third World Approaches to International Law, or TWIL, you indicate that your politics led you to TWIL. In your words, you wrote, and I quote, "I suspect that if I did not come across TWIL, I would have had to invent it." You conclude your study of TWIL's agenda in that paper by stating, "I can let my scholarship be determined by my rage at seeing international law yet again define and subjugate people in former colonies. Or I can expose, articulate, and scrutinize the hopes and expectations I had that led to that rage. I can then craft narratives that connect various ideas together and share my experiences with others. And it is in these moments of telling different stories and listening to others where change happens." I'll just start with some of the initial questions I have. We have established that your intellectual commitment is with TWIL. You organized a TWIL conference entitled Third World Approaches to International Law, Capitalism and the Common Good in October 2011. However, one of the criticisms of TWIL is that it is solely an intellectual philosophical movement. But we see in 2015 Cairo Twill conference, a major theme was praxis and international. And Georges Abissab posed 3 scenarios for Twill scholars: confrontation, participation, or operation behind enemy lines. How does your work as Special Rapporteur on the right to food relate to the choices that Abissab has posed?
Thank you, Titi, and just thank you for such a generous introduction, and thank you to all the editors of Afronomics. I've been such a huge fan, and you know, many TWAIL colleagues are involved with Afronomics and are following it. And to hear you sort of quote my words back to me from about 10 years ago, it feels like someone else wrote those words and it was another lifetime ago, if last year felt like another lifetime. So, and to hear it from your voice, literally from your voice, it really makes me think about those words anew in a fresh perspective. And just, I'm a different person from when I wrote that. Excuse me. So, I think you captured exactly my intellectual trajectory by focusing on the Cairo conference and that call for praxis. So as you pointed out, one of the criticisms of TWAIL is that it was, you know, just an intellectual movement. But I think every movement has its own life and it has its own history. So what TWAIL gave me in the beginning was that sense of community, that sense of meaning and purpose that I wasn't finding anywhere else. So, you know, some friends have teased me about that line you quoted that I would have had to invent TWAIL myself. They said, that's a bit arrogant of you that you were going to invent TWAIL all on your own. But what I meant by that was, you know, when I was in law school, the way international law was being taught to me didn't resonate with how I grew up, how I lived, and how I experienced the world as someone from Lebanon, as someone who was a migrant, as someone who was living in a settler colony at the time in Canada. And when I read TWAIL literature and TWAIL scholarship of the time, it captured my reality. And I immediately thought, I want to be part of whatever this is. And I want to contribute to it as well. That's profound. I think that political project of creating an intellectual community of academics and practitioners, of people to read and think and imagine the world anew is hard work. It's hard work. So I want to give credit to sort of the elders of TWAIL, if we might call them that. I mean, thankfully, none of them are here, so we can call them that, right? Out of respect and slightly teasing them as well. And so just an intellectual project, that's hard work, right? They created that community, and that community building always has to continue, right? That's always part of a movement, is different people at different times strengthen the movement. There's new voices, new people, new energy. The elders, now that, you know, I'm a bit more gray, you know, we have to step aside and be told what to do. We're not leading, we lead from behind, you know, and listen more as we get older and speak when asked, right? That's, I think, a different role as one gets older in a movement and in a tradition. But then that call in Cairo for a more praxis, or, you know, I would practice and theory oriented trajectory for TWAIL, I think was quite right. It's about timing. That was the time to do that. There was something that the movement was ready. There was enough people. There was multiple generations involved. There was a breadth and a depth in the movement that one could do that. And George Abissab was there. He's of a generation that inspired many of us, right? He was writing straight after Bandung. He's writing in the mid 50s and the late 50s and never stopped, and had a long, illustrious career in different institutions, always maintaining his independent and unique voice, never compromising his political perspective, but finding nuanced ways to articulate it through law and legal discourse and as an institutional actor. And also other people like Obi Okafor were getting involved in the human rights system. And so I was really inspired. And that speech by Abissab, that's what changed everything for me. That's when I decided, okay, I need to do something more. That you know, part of praxis teaching is doing, researching is doing, reading is doing. But I wanted to be involved in institutions, in the subjects of my study. I wanted to jump in, but I didn't know what that meant or how I would do that. I just carried that with me. And then I was shameless. I just constantly looked for an opportunity. I talked to people and told people, you know, what should I be doing? And then the opportunity arose to apply for Special Rapporteur. At the time, other TWAIL people had done it. So I thought, this is possible. Obi Okafor, Tendaye Chume, she was a Special Rapporteur. and they really inspired me as well. And they encouraged me to apply, and I applied. I just put my name forward with, no big expectations, and I got the position, and I haven't looked back, and it's been exhilarating. And I have to say that my TWAIL training has been so key in how I've navigated this position. And I had to jump in quick. I started in May in the midst of a pandemic. So my TWAIL training, my historical sensibility, my understanding of law and politics allowed me, I think, to very quickly start having an impact through this position.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. And I totally understand when you're saying that having this intellectual community gives you some purpose and drive in your scholarship and in the way you even begin to think and rethink international law and the work that you're doing. I think it just gives us that push to know that we have support, we have friends that we could call on when we're thinking about a concept and just wanting to bounce off ideas. And I feel for me as well that the TWAIL conference in Singapore changed my scholarship. I met you there, and I know I was asking everybody, I don't know what category, whether to put you in the category of the TWAIL elders or the mid, what category would you? And the question I was kept asking everybody is, what is TWAIL? How do I apply TWAIL in my scholarship? When I want to write, how does my TWAIL sensibility contribute to my work? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And one thing that I have found about TWAIL is that it's an epistemic community, like you have mentioned. Mm. And so I'm really delighted that you have seen how TWAIL has sort of driven your purpose in this mandate that you have as a special rapporteur on the right to food. And next we'll go into a bit more into what your hopes are for the mandate and how you would like to unpack that. In your speech at the 2020 edition of the World Trade Organization Agriculture Symposium entitled Agricultural Trade and Food Systems Transformation, which you presented alongside the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and the Special Envoy for the United Nations Secretary General for the 2021 Food Systems Summit, you highlighted that the core debate in agriculture has always been the issue of subsidies, not so much the issue of tariffs. In this regard, you mentioned the need to renegotiate what was understood to be good subsidies and bad subsidies. Could you please discuss the thematic areas that you would focus on for your mandate and why you have chosen these areas?
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Titi, for that question. That was a very interesting moment for me first as a scholar. Let me start as that and then shift into my work as a rapporteur. Also highlighting that relationship between one's scholarship and practice. So I had been studying trade and the WTO for the last 20 years. And I always took a historical perspective. So I've looked at multilateral regimes starting from the 1900s up until today. And that took me a long time. Was long work, and to build that historical repertoire of understanding. And it was in that moment when I was invited by the WTO, speaking with the head of the FAO, with the current acting, for all intents and purposes, the acting director general can say of the WTO, especially when it comes to agriculture. And that historical perspective allowed me to appreciate the current moment we're in. And it allowed me also to be a better listener, to listen to what the people from the WTO were saying and what people from the FAO were saying, and to appreciate the shift in ideas and discourse. And so when I presented my position, as you pointed out, that the WTO, when it comes to agriculture, it's not really about tariffs when it comes to agriculture. The debate in agriculture is about subsidies, and it's about what's a good subsidy, what's a bad subsidy. And my historical research allowed me to say that those ideas always change. So it allowed me to put forward to open up the politics without being political, to say it's always a matter of negotiation, debate, compromise to figure out what is a subsidy that stabilizes the market, that creates a fair market, that makes life better, that improves welfare, and what is a subsidy that disrupts the market, that is unfair, etc. That's always in flux. So that historical research allowed me to do that. And then what was very interesting to me is that the Deputy Director General, Alan Wolf, mirrored a lot of what I had to say, obviously not everything. First, he identified food as a moral issue. And that's a big shift. Because, you know, about 10, if not 15 years ago now, when Pascal Lamy was Director General, the debate at the time was, is the WTO a place to talk about food security? And his position, shared by many in the trade community, was that, no, the WTO might indirectly affect food security, but it creates a stable international market, and it's for domestic countries. They have the flexibility within the WTO system to do what they need to do domestically to deal with food security. So food security 15 years ago was framed as a domestic issue, and then the international was left to trade. So for that shift, framing food as a moral issue aligns it more with a human rights perspective. And there was an understanding that and Alan Wolf has been someone who's been at this for decades. There was an understanding now at higher decision makers at higher levels, that food security is a WTO issue. And then to have the Director General of the FAO also articulate that more explicitly, food is a human right, and that subsidies matter, and that you have to have what he articulated. He said, you need to tax. You need to use the tax system to, for example, deal with practices that are harmful to the climate, etc. And there was an interesting moment where, as rapporteur, I was in between the FAO perspective and the WTO perspective. And I felt there's a new moment. And what I'm hoping now after that is maybe to try and encourage that alignment and encourage the FAO and the WTO to work more closely together, to have a deeper alliance. The FAO has a long tradition of trade and development thinking and working closely directly with countries and national governments. And the WTO, obviously, being that multilateral space. So it was a moment of a discursive shift, I feel. And I hope we can turn that, everyone, right? So people watching from Afronomics and the like. Now, the UN Special Envoy from the Secretary General Agnes Kalibata highlighted regional agreements. She highlighted the forthcoming African regional trade agreement. But what's interesting about those existing regional agreements that are popping up now, all the new ones, they might identify food security as an important issue, but none of them address the issue of subsidies, and none of them actually address food security head on. They fall back on old thinking of opening markets and tariffs and the like, and they're very business friendly, but helping businesses doesn't necessarily mean ensuring that people have access to adequate food, to good food, if you will. And so I think this is an opportunity, especially in the continent of Africa, to think about how can trade serve the people? How can markets serve the people? Because up until now, trade regimes have done the opposite. We've been serving the markets, and we've been serving one very narrow vision of what is a liberal trade regime. And the continent of Africa, of course, historically is used to feed others. And this is an opportunity for Africans to feed Africans, right, broadly defined. And what would that even mean, and what would that even look like? And that would be an interesting sort of vision to think about into the future. So we'll see where that goes, but it was just a very exciting moment for me intellectually and discursively. So I learned a lot from that moment at the WTO.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. And if we could go into the thematic areas now that you would like to focus on for your mandate, and why you have in those areas.
Yeah. So, I recently, and you were involved, Titi, I held an expert consultation to get advice from friends and comrades and colleagues and people maybe I didn't know well, but I wanted to become friends with, and just trying to understand what's going on. So, of course, the primary issue is COVID. One can't do anything without thinking about COVID, but more specifically, what everyone, I think, appreciates today is that COVID is not just a public health crisis, but it's created a hunger crisis. People all over the world, rich countries and poor countries alike, are facing hunger in profound ways, in unprecedented ways. But hunger was an issue before COVID. So COVID has exacerbated already existing inequalities and made them worse. So in a way, the virus has been feeding upon our inequalities. It strikes the more marginalized people in predictable ways, and that's what allows it to continue, and that's what makes its effects brutal. So these inequalities that we've been living with so long, we're still living with them. And what I've learned from feminist colleagues and feminist comrades is to try and think of COVID not just as public health or hunger or economic crises, all these multiple crises, but the broader way of as a crisis of care. And what that means to me, and that's how I'm going to frame my thinking about COVID and food throughout my mandate, and encourage others to do the same, is a crisis of care means we're not, so there's this language in that we get from economics that people talk of trade-offs. Let's think about, okay, the tension between addressing people's health versus keeping the economy productive. If you lock everything down, it's safer for everyone and you protect their health, but you shut down the economy. If you open the economy too fast, people get sick. So they talk of trade-offs. But I think trade-offs as a framework is limited because it imagines that you can only do one or the other and that you have to sacrifice. It's this logic of sacrifice. You have to sacrifice people for the economy, or you have to sacrifice the economy for people. And both of them it's a very brutal way, I think, of thinking. If you think of terms of care, care gives us a way of understanding things in terms of priorities, values, and sequencing. What do we do first? Who do we need to protect first to empower everybody, right? To make everybody stronger. Who takes care of us? Who are the people that make sure everyone is well fed and taken care of? That's the care mentality. And then if you protect the caretakers of society, then everyone's stronger. So it's not a talk of sacrifice, but it's a talk of strengthening people. Food is at the core of care, right? Feeding ourselves. We have to feed ourselves. We have to eat well. We have to have a good meal before we go out and work. If I don't eat, I don't work. It's very simple. And who feeds me? So first, I need to think, who's feeding me? My mother, my father, my neighbor, my community, my shopkeeper, my farmer, the fisher. Like, it's about relationships and strengthening those relationships. So thinking in terms of care, for me, when I learned that from feminist colleagues and others, really opened up my thinking, and I think would allow me to think systemically. So that's sort of the COVID thing, and that's sort of the big picture. The other element I'm hoping to focus on is thinking about food systems, because there's going to be a food systems summit in the fall of 2021. So the UN Secretary General called for a food systems summit. This is before COVID, and has a UN Special Envoy, Agnes Kalibata, who's the former president of the African oh dear, I should remember this, Green Revolution Alliance, that's what there. So that she comes from that sort of background. So there's an African perspective that's really influencing this food systems summit. And it's coming together slowly. And the idea for the summit is to focus everybody's attention on food. And the idea being that in the past, food tends to be landing in the ministers of agriculture in their portfolio. And food is not just an agriculture issue. It's systemic, so it falls upon all sectors of society, all stakeholders in society, and all of that. And so I'm bringing two things to the Food Systems Summit. One, the summit is still being organized. And one of the criticisms of the summit is it hasn't really given human rights a central role. And that it's been very much focused from a very business perspective, a very perspective deeply influenced by the World Economic Forum. Now that's changed. Now there's a little bit more room for human rights, but it's on the margins. So I'm, involved, and this is to go back to the Abi Saab part. I'm sort of some sort of agitator in some ways. I don't know if I'm behind enemy lines just yet. I have 1 foot in, 1 foot out, so to speak, right? To use that metaphor. And to try and make it maybe a better summit in some ways, but also to be a critical voice, and to provide an analysis and to be able to judge the summit on human rights terms. and to say, okay, look, systems analysis is important. It allows us to understand food as connecting all these different parts of the economy, of society, all these moving parts. But a systems way of thinking, it comes from a way of understanding things in very mechanical terms. And there's no sense of empowerment or agency of how does change happen. And that's a human rights perspective brings that. It puts the power in the hands of people. People change things. How do people change things? No one's asking that at the high levels of the Food Systems Summit. So I want to bring that analysis and make sure that when people think beyond the summit, so the summit will come and go, but past the summit, when we think about food systems, we have to think about how do people organize themselves, come together, build new alliances, and think systemically and act systemically. And I think human rights has something to bring in that regard. And I'm learning about how to systemically change food systems from people that have been doing it for a long time, from the social movements, right? From the food sovereignty movements, from the peasant movements of fishers and pastoralists as well, from the labor unions. So it's from the movements who are always thinking systemically, who are always using their power, using their collective power and organizing collectively, that I've been learning about how food systems can change. Last two topics, one has been truly inspired by your own work, TT, is on seeds, on the power of seeds. And I am not an expert in intellectual property, right? I bring my own particular sensibility, but learning from 12 colleagues and comrades like yourself and others to really appreciate that we're at a moment where understanding farmers' rights, because whoever controls seeds controls everything, controls plants, controls the food system, controls our relationship to land, controls our relationship with each other. And so, so that part I sort of understood, but very specifically, the idea of farmers' rights, the people who are growing the plants, who are harvesting the plants, who are sharing the seeds, who are creating new varieties through their long-standing practices, creating land-race varieties, right? Varieties based on the farmer's relationship with the land and with the ecosystem and the community. What's at stake is who's going to control those seeds. And as I've learned from your work, TT, is international law is a bit disjointed and fragmented. What are farmers' rights is an open question. Which treaty should define farmers' rights is a question. The International Plant Treaty, that's the short form, I'll just call it that, has the most human rights approach, I think, as a starting point, but there are other treaties and regimes that focus more on private property and that mentality. So I want to make farmers' rights, bring it front and center, and try and work with others to articulate it in a way that empowers farmers and increases biodiversity, right? And I think the International Plant Treaty is a place to start. And you're part of the process of where countries are taking stock of seeing who's implementing the plant treaty in a way domestically that's serving farmers in a particular way. So I'm still learning a lot, and I hope to continue that work. And then the final issue has to do with how food, and more specifically, how hunger and famine is being used increasingly as a weapon, right? This is food in the context of armed conflicts, of protracted crises, as people call it, war, and the point there is just, I'm seeing it everywhere. Hunger and famine is consciously used as a weapon to punish civilians. And it's leading to famine. So where you see famine, you're seeing political choices through embargoes, economic embargoes, through blockades, and leading to situations where people are starving, famine, and the like. Now, my starting point is to look at international criminal law and international humanitarian law. Again, that's an area where I'm drawing on the expertise of others. But I also come from a tradition that knows deeply the limitations of international criminal law and international humanitarian law. And so actually drawing on the work of James Gatti, understanding that the relationship between war and commerce is key. So that's where I'm trying. This is really, for me, new territory for me, but new territory, I think, for a lot of people, is how do we combine research in international commercial law and international humanitarian law and international criminal law and human rights law in a way where it's not just about making sure that people are not contravening their obligations in terms of right to food, but to understand the root causes of war, right? So one way of understanding war is but a phase of commercial negotiation, right? It's just another way of doing business for many parties. So by following the money, by understanding that role of commerce, to see then, to understand the root causes of war, that'll lead, I think, many of us to understand, again, how food is turned into a weapon. And so that'll be, I think, the last thing I address at the end of my mandate.
Thank you, Michael. Those are 4 crucial aspects of food. And one of the things I'm hearing from that is how food is interconnected with other sectors of international law. So food is not just about how we consume, but it's also about how it is produced. It's also about the economic relations that arise from our commercialization of food. It's about humanitarian law. It's about environmental law. How do we ensure that the production of food does not lead to decline in our biodiversity or depletion of our biodiversity? So we see this, like you've said already, fragmentation of laws, but we also see pluralism. We see lots of intersections just around international law. And I liked how you talked about, some of the underlying concerns about food and the crisis of care. I think it's a powerful frame for your work, and I'm delighted that you're thinking about food in this way. So you've said 4 main thematic areas that you're going to work on: COVID-19, a pandemic because of the realities of our current circumstances, food systems, farmers' rights, and food in the context of armed conflicts. Excellent. If we could take a step back, perhaps, how would you conceptualize or define the right to food in the context of these 4 thematic areas that you have decided to engage in?
Yeah, so many people will start with a definition of the right to food that it says, the right to food is the freedom from hunger. And this comes out of, the text of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But what I've been seeing in just the role of food also empowers people. It's not just about preventing hunger. And so for me, food is the right for people to eat good food, right, together, in communion. Food is how communities define themselves. It has a constituting power. So it's about people defining for themselves what is good food. When I start with that idea, it opens up food in cultural terms, in political terms. It's not just about calories, and it highlights power. And it highlights that food it's how we take care of each other. It's how we celebrate life. So food is a way, so the right to food includes the right to celebrate life with our communities, right? With our own people and with our neighbors and with our kin. And with strangers. And that celebration is not just trivial or marginal. That's a core element of life. And I think COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of celebrating life and celebrating each other as a way of nourishing each other, strengthening each other. So, that's a definition that I've learned. And the other thing, sort of, as you reflected back to me, Titi, the other thing I've learned is just from my own country in Lebanon. Lebanon has experienced an explosion which sort of created collective trauma, maybe more profound than the Civil War, one might say. It's created it made an existing hunger crisis even worse. And it's just this, and this is all on top of a financial collapse that has been going on for years now. And a political system of just corrupt politicians that are so cold-blooded when it comes to the people. So, and what I learned in Lebanon and being involved and having friends and family there is when you're faced with unsurmountable odds, when you're faced with a government where even if you yell your claims, there was a huge uprising in October a year ago, and nothing came of it. People almost, tore down the government and nothing changed. So it made me we can't be hopeless. What do we do? So it made me realize a couple of things also, is if you change the food system, you can change everything. but you don't have to then change the banks. Whatever. If you focus on food, you can change your whole country. And you can protect that sector of food because it connects to all these other things. Once you change the food, you change the food system, the effects can potentially spread out to all the other parts of society and government and etc. But the other thing about food and organizing around food, you don't have to wait for the government. You organize yourselves, right? You build it through labor unions, through solidarity networks of peasant unions, of farmer groups, because the power of food is always in the hands of the people. We feed ourselves, right? We feed ourselves through our relationships, through the land, through our relationships with the land, and even through international commerce, through relationships with others. So Lebanon being in the worst situation one can imagine, where you don't have a functioning government, you have a financial system that's collapsed, where you have an explosion that created trauma. For me, there's no, the idea of are you hopeful or not hopeful, it's irrelevant. Basically, the choice in Lebanon is we have no choice but to be fearless. And that fearlessness is what I hope to bring to the right to food and to the understanding of food systems, because I think many communities are faced with that necessity of being fearless. And that fearlessness means organizing together and taking care of each other. And we take turns. Some days I need someone to take care of me. I need to be fed. I need to be nourished. Other days when I'm feeling better and I'm in a better position, it's my turn to take care of others. So that's sort of how my ideas are both connecting in the abstract, but then in a very specific way, sort of relating to my own country.
Thank you, Michael. When you were speaking about that Lebanon as well, I was remembering my home country, Nigeria, and we've had similar circumstances where poverty, hunger, just when you're just tired of inefficiencies and you're tired of just a government that doesn't respond, you see people also just coming to the streets, but you don't get a positive reaction. So what do you do? And one question about this is also around the choices that people would make. So in this regard, with food, we know that there are growing trends, for example, of multinational corporations sort of proliferating around the world, especially in the global south now. Mm-hmm. And you see the introduction of new types of seeds, so new varieties of seed that are often protected either by patents or plant breeders' rights systems. Mm-hmm. You also see an increase in industrialized agriculture, use of fertilizers, chemicals. You see large farms. You see a decline in small-scale farming or sort of sustainable agroecological types of farming. When this coronavirus pandemic is over and you're able to undertake country visits, where would you prioritize and where would you begin to have conversations about these 4 thematic areas that you have committed your mandate to?
Yeah. So the top of my list, and I've currently put out a request, is to visit Senegal. So that is a place. The reason I hope to visit Senegal, it might not work out, but the reason I prioritize Senegal whenever I'm able to travel, God willing, that Senegal, and hopefully the Senegalese government accepts my request, is not to criticize and to say, obviously I'll be critical and identify of how the government in Senegal can improve in meeting their right to food obligations. But Senegal is one of the leading countries in the world on trying to bring agroecological methods on a national scale. And what I mean by agroecology is it's so there's the scientific method of agroecology, which is about using ecological science, so not necessarily agronomics or agricultural science, which is focused on productivity, and it's a very industrial model in the last 50 years. But it's drawing from a different group of scientists, of ecologists, to understand of how can we grow and raise animals and create food for ourselves in a way that mimics nature, that aligns with nature, that follows the pattern of nature and the rhythms of nature more. And that's not a new way, it's a new word, but that's often, those are old practices and old traditions. So it's about bringing new science and new ideas and new technology to enhance and augment those already existing practices that are embedded within ecological processes. Senegal, the government and the people, the social movements, so it comes from the ground up, it comes from the people in Senegal, are committing to trying to make the whole country a place of agroecological practice. And agroecology does not make a distinction between the scientific and the social side of things. It understands that justice, fairness, and good relations with the land and good relations with each other as people and good relations with non-human life forms is a central feature. It's not something you deal with after the fact. It's a central feature of how we create food. And so, a place like Senegal, the other place in the African continent is Kenya, has been a place that's sort of been trying to think about in those terms. So those are the two places. So Senegal, I have an official request out there, and hopefully that works out. Kenya would be on top of my list as well, because again, these are the rare governments that are focusing on a national scale. And I want to highlight those practices and to show examples. Senegal's a leader. Kenya's a leader, both the people and the government. There's room to improve and, all of that, but it means it can be done. Mexico is another country in which this newer government, now with the elections in Bolivia also, but Mexico is a government where their Minister of Agriculture has articulated a vision also that aligns in this particular way. Countries in Europe like France and Switzerland are committing funding to this idea. So you have some donors, but not enough. So what I'm trying to do then is I want to visit places and countries to try and bring these alliances and connect agroecological practices. I also want to have multiple, have a broader perspective regionally and definitely cover the different regions and focus on places that are struggling and that are, Yemen is one of the biggest crises in our world today. It's an example where there's famine in profound ways, and it's the clear result of geopolitics. Will I be able to visit Yemen? Will I visit Yemen? That's a more open question. If you ask my parents, they will say Michael is not going to visit Yemen, but I don't think they'll watch this interview, so we won't tell them. But my commitment to places like Yemen and other places where famine is on the rise, so we'll see where I can visit in that regard. And then, of course, I'm looking at all parts of, in Latin America, I'm still thinking where I might be able to visit. In Brazil, the decimation of indigenous peoples' land, the rolling back on their right to food. Brazil used to have a leading program on feeding children, universal access for all children. Because of COVID, they've had to roll it back. So I want to maybe go visit Brazil and see what's going on. You guys used to have in Brazil one of the best right to food programs. Why did you have to roll it back? What happened? How can we help you? How can you help others? How can you help yourselves? Thinking in those terms. I want to visit so-called rich countries. They have problems too. Human rights is not just how you critique, the developing countries, and it's not, in Europe and North America, often they treat human rights as a problem over there. It's a problem everywhere. So here in the United States, I live in Oregon. Oregon is an agriculturally based community. So maybe an official visit to the United States, I think, is due. With this new government, they might be more open to something like that. The United Kingdom has a complicated relationship. They've not been feeding their children properly through the school program, but the United Kingdom has a very active right to food community from the grassroots, right? So I'm looking at places where there's hope on the ground, where people are ready, and where I can bring a little bit of energy to activate that and help people organize themselves. So it's still very open, and I welcome others to push their governments to invite me. But again, we'll see. I don't know if I'll be able to travel. I'm trying to be creative in thinking about how I can be most effective even without traveling.
Thank you so much, Michael. And so when you were talking, I was thinking about how we can learn lessons from one another. So how can countries like Senegal share with other African countries how they are undertaking this agroecological revolution? And I think that might be one of the ways you could contribute with this mandate of sharing, putting those examples on a global platform, and drawing lessons for different countries. Of course, our agricultural systems, our soil types would all be different, but we can draw particular lessons that would be relevant to a country that perhaps has some similar agricultural characteristics or compositions. And I think that would be an excellent intervention with your mandate. And I also liked the idea of building perhaps alliances. And so if we're doing it at the sub-regional level or even at the regional level, having some sort of collective voices and approaches to some of our agricultural systems, could help in a more powerful way in addressing the questions we have around food and sustainability of our food production. One question that I get asked is, can agroecological production methods sustainably feed the world?
Yeah, that's the question. So in terms of, I'll start with research and then talk about funding and then talk about maybe the future. In terms of the research currently in agroecology, I think it's coming together, and more people are making arguments and are finding evidence that agroecological practices, if they're scaled up, can feed the world, right? So currently, just in the world today, we currently produce more food than we need on just a per capita basis, just a really rough number. And then people will highlight, of course, that the world's population is increasing and the like. I think agroecology, so the evidence points to, yes, it can be more productive. I think it's there, and of course, more work needs to be done in that regard, and that small scale is important, but how do you then make that a more systemic issue is a bigger question. How you need an agroecological system for it to clearly feed everyone in a stable way. Right now, agroecological practices might feed particular communities. That part is clear. And so that's that systemic question that's out there. And I think agroecology is well positioned in those systemic terms because it thinks broadly, because it reconciles with ideas of social equity, political systems, and the like. I think a lot more research does need to be done in terms of theories of labor in agroecology. So agroecology is a more labor-intensive way of producing food versus industrial models and are more capital-intensive. They require money, and they put the power in the hands of a few people. Agroecology puts the power in the hands of a lot of people, so you need a political system to organize people in that way. But it comes from people organizing themselves. So part of my work will try to encourage research and to bring research on theories of labor, because you can have a small-scale farmer, but that small-scale farmer is also often an employer, right? If it's labor-intensive, it's not just the farmer and their family maybe, but they're going to have migrant workers or their neighbors or whatever. And right now, agroecology is built on a political alliance. The labor unions support agroecology in solidarity with food producers, but there needs to be a deeper sort of, I think, political, theoretical framework for that on the labor front. So that's the theory and the research behind it. But what's clear is that right now agroecology is underfunded. So investment in research today has been primarily focused on industrial methods that are capital heavy, that use carbon, that burn up land, basically, in effect, burn up people, that are just it consumes input, output, right? It's not this sort of circular way of thinking. And most agricultural research, and this is a new study that just recently came out, highlighted not only is it very focused on industrial methods, it only I think the number was like 2% of agricultural research today directly serves small farmers. Agroecology is, by definition, comes from the knowledge of indigenous people, comes from the knowledge of small farmers, and it's a relationship between professional researchers and people who their knowledge comes from practice, from experimental knowledge and experiential knowledge, or what some might call traditional knowledge. And I think there's a lot more room to invest in agroecological research. So right now, like I mentioned, France and Switzerland, the FAO to some degree, a little bit from the International Fund for Agriculture and Development, they invest a little bit. But I think more and more people are realizing that that you can put a lot more money in that research, and this will be money well spent. There's political appetite, there's intellectual appetite, and excuse the pun, I didn't even realize I did that. But also more importantly, there's, in terms of people on the ground, there's that solidarity behind the idea. That people are ready to create more knowledge and to use that knowledge. So I think that's where I am hopeful about agroecology. And I think that criticism, I understand where it's coming from. It comes from, again, just this lack of research, more research that can happen, but it's very promising.
Thank you, Michael. And I just applaud your optimism on that front.
I've been called worse.
And I think that the international regimes, the international institutions have a fundamental role to play in this as well, like you might rightly mentioned, to the FAO, the IFAD. And we know that in terms of the treaties as well, we know that some of the treaties, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, mm-hmm. the Nagoya Protocol, mm-hmm. and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, support these sort of agroecological movements. But then we know that they're at the national levels, because of sort of the fragmentation and the pockets of the different government institutions that work on these, we don't have a collaborative take or position, from the government. So, for example, you have many times the Ministry of Environment mm-hmm. dealing with, some of the environmental regimes, and they don't speak sometimes with the ministries of trade and commerce yeah. that are dealing with mm-hmm. the trade issues that might be able to think about how to balance these agroecological provisions with the trade sort of conversations. And then we have discussions around intellectual property, sometimes as a different institution or with the Ministry of Trade. And mm-hmm. then we also have the Ministry of Agriculture. So it's those different pockets. And we see that also reflected in the international instruments, yeah. where we see the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, the ITPGRFA. We have the United Nations instruments as well. So mm-hmm. we have Declaration on Rights of Peasants, Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have current negotiations ongoing at the WIPO, Intergovernmental Committee. So we have all of these conversations ongoing. Yeah. But the question, usually remains that these people, the peoples, indigenous peoples with the experiential knowledge or, the experimental knowledge, the questions are always on the platform, and the yeah. research and the data and the funding in helping to promote the types of knowledge which I believe, can contribute to sustainable food production. So yeah. I just celebrate your acknowledgement and your work on that, and I look forward to seeing how that would progress and unfold as we carry on. Now, I want to ask you, if you're going to look back on your mandate, at the expiration of your mandate, what would you like to have achieved?
That's a big question, especially, these days. So, truly just at a personal level, this is such a wonderful opportunity to be a special rapporteur. There's an immense amount of power and responsibility, and I try and hold myself accountable to the people, to the social movements, the food sovereignty movements, and the right to food community, to keep me in check and to serve that community first and foremost. But there's very little resources that comes with this position. So this is not being facetious by any means. I hope my son doesn't judge me poorly at the end of this. I hope I stay a good father, and I maintain that, taking care of him, and he takes care of me and my, my spouse. And I hope I hold my family together, and that they don't judge me poorly at the end. They're the community I hold myself responsible to first. And if they say I did a good job and I was a good member of the family, then my conscience is clear. I think that's, in this day and age, I think that's important for everyone to manage their life that way. Then, the other community, as I mentioned, that I'll hold myself accountable is the movements that have made the right to food this very powerful, progressive, potentially radical tool. And if I could sort of contribute to deepening the sense of solidarity in that movement, I'll be happy. If I can strengthen the ties that people have, like between land and labor, right? Between the peasants, the pastoralists, the fisher folk, and the unions, to continue bringing them together closer, helping them align their interests and identifying new ways of collaborating. But I want to bring something to that alliance and to that sense of solidarity is the lawyers, as my comrades in international law, from Afronomics, from the International Economic Law Collective, from TWAIL. I think there's a lot of good legal work. I don't want to be the only one in that movement. I want my social movement to join that one. I want to bring that alliance. So if I can deepen that relationship between the lawyers and the social movements, I'll be happy. I'll be very happy. And then if I could then, while I'm doing this position, I'm doing my best. When you reflected my words back to me, I'm like, I guess I don't have any new ideas in the last 10 years. I mean, I want to be able to share my journey. While I'm learning, I want to be able to share what I'm learning with everybody as I go. I am in a position of privilege where I see how power works. I am in a position to see how power from the ground up works, how power works within institutions, how power works in secret meetings and closed door meetings, how power works in public forums. And I want to be able to continue sharing what I'm learning in those spaces with everybody as much as possible. And if I'm able to be a good storyteller and that I tell a story that connects with people in all their different contexts, I think I'll be happy. And then if I leave with new friends, I think that in the end, that's a good thing, right? If I have new friendships out of this rapporteurship, this will hopefully just be one, thing. I'm these days, I guess I'm tired and cranky. I just want to go back to gardening and maybe writing another book and just being a good teacher. And if I can do that, but with new friendships along the way and with new knowledge, I think I will be kind to myself and say I did a decent job. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. That's brilliant. And while you were saying that, I was just thinking about one final question. So if we have listeners wanting to contribute to the realization of the right to food, what can people do? What can people do at the individual level? What can they do at the community level? So you've said that it's not always the governments, right? So final word. Listeners, Afronomicslaw.org listeners, our comrades from the International Economic Law Collective, general comrades from the Global South, all our friends thinking about how they can contribute to right to food. What would you say?
So my theory of change is organize, organize, organize. So find the people that have been in the struggle already. Every country, every community has a group of food producers, whether they're food workers, or peasants, farmers, pastoralists, fisher folk, people working in kitchens, in the fields. There is a strong food movement out there already, and it's been working for decades. Find who they are. They've already been organizing. Join that movement, right? Find those groups. There's so many umbrella organizations. So the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, the People's Coalition for Food Sovereignty, particular organizations like La Via Campesina, local food unions, food worker unions, the big one being the IUF, the International Union of Food Workers, which is a big umbrella food union, the largest in the world, and it has its sister organizations everywhere. Find those groups, make friends with them, join their movement. As lawyers, we shouldn't be leading from the front. Go listen, see what they've already been doing, and bring your own expertise, your own experience, your own personality, and see how you can serve that movement with your knowledge, with your teaching. Teach your students. Sometimes, so obviously not everyone can join the movement or the particular movement through your teaching. Teach, if you're a teacher, teach your students to be the lawyer to serve the movement. Connecting, right? So bringing that law and social movement perspective, what type of knowledge, what type of expertise should a new lawyer have to serve those movements? So as a teacher, I think, and this is where I'm most hopeful, is I've always had an ambivalent relationship with being a teacher, because it just took me a while to find my comfort level. And I've been inspired by other people who are better teachers than me, like Luisa Slava, Sanjay Pahuja, mentors like Tony Angie and Chimney. These are great teachers. James, Gatti, Obiokafor. I always was like, oh, they're so good at teaching. I just find I bumble and I ramble and I just say stuff and then I run away. But slowly I become more comfortable, and I've learned through my comrades and through my students, from my students, that teaching is a profoundly hopeful practice. And it's a radical practice, and in the long term, it's building the foundation of a new world.
Professor Michael Fakhri, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, thank you very much for your excellent insights in our Indaba, and we look forward to continuing conversations with you.
Thank you, Titi, and thank you to everyone. This was a pleasure, and really, really, I learned so much from our conversation as always, and I look forward to meeting new people from this conversation. Thank you.